A few days ago, there was a political earthquake in the United States that directly affects Europe and could completely upend the future of Europe. The significance of the updated National Security Strategy 2025 of the United States can hardly be overstated. It is not an ordinary document, it is not a technical report, not a diplomatic formality, and certainly not just a mere update of previous strategies. It is a political earthquake, one that reaches far beyond Washington. Anyone interested in how the United States is reshaping its global role, why Europe suddenly appears not as a partner, but as a problem, and which tectonic shifts will shape our security order in the coming years, anyone interested cannot ignore this national security strategy. This document marks a historic turning point. It not only describes what the United States wants, but also what it is no longer willing to do. It reveals how power, influence, and responsibility are divided in a rapidly changing world. It forces Europeans to confront tough questions. Where do we stand? What is at stake? What do we expect from the United States? And are we prepared for the answers to no longer be the same as they have been for the past 80 years? In this video, we will analyze this bombshell from the United States, which must serve as a wake-up call for Europe. Heiliger Stroh says, "Use my code to save big at Holy now." The National Security Strategy has been one of the central strategic documents of the United States since 1986. It defines how the United States of America positions itself in the world, what priorities it sets, and by what means it wants to pursue its interests. Normally, it is, to put it plainly, largely bipartisan and aimed at ensuring continuity in American foreign and security policy. However, the 2025 edition marks a clear break. This national security strategy is explicitly political, openly partisan, and unusually direct in its language. It not only described classic priorities, but also candidly expressed the ideological stance of the current United States administration. That makes it more meaningful. It shows how the United States defines its role in an increasingly fragmented world order and what expectations it will have of partners and allies in the future. At the same time, the National Security Strategy 2025 has left behind fundamental guidelines from previous decades. It has relativized the United States' claim to be a global ordering power and instead emphasized a strategic self-positioning that is more domestically motivated and less focused on international responsibility. In its clarity and severity, it has represented a foreign policy turning point that forces both Europe and Asia to reassess their own positions toward the United States. The National Security Strategy 2025 opens an exceptionally transparent window into the self-image of the United States under the current administration. It describes a country that is challenged not by external adversaries, but above all by internal conflicts, ideological, social, and institutional. This self-diagnosis is formulated with unusual openness and forms the foundation of the entire security policy approach. Central to this is the portrayal of the United States of America as a nation engaged in a deep struggle. The strategy emphasizes that political polarization, cultural tensions, and a perceived loss of traditional values have undermined the strength of the country. This creates a strategic narrative that closely links security policy with ideas for domestic reform. National renewal is presented as a prerequisite for international capacity to act. What stands out in particular is the elevation of domestic issues to key security policy concerns. Migration, social identity conflicts, questions of freedom of speech, and supposed restrictions through censorship are not merely considered domestic political issues, but are explicitly described as threats to national security. The National Security Strategy 2025 states that internal instability weakens the United States' ability to focus on international challenges. This significantly shifts the definition of security away from traditional military threats toward political and cultural conflicts within the country. This shift is accompanied by a strong personalization. While previous strategies deliberately adopted an institutional perspective, the National Security Strategy 2025 explicitly places Donald Trump and his political movement at the center of the security policy guidelines. The strategy reflects the view that the United States has been weakened by decades of misguided policies and now needs to change course, which is firmly anchored in the president's domestic agenda. This personal imprint departs from the tradition of creating strategic documents in a bipartisan, institutional way. The National Security Strategy 2025 also marks a profound turning point in the assessment of previous foreign policy principles. The decades-long conviction that alliances, multilateral institutions, and global presence generated American strength is being called into question. Instead, the document portrays international commitments as potential burdens and calls for a renewed focus on national sovereignty and strategic self-sufficiency. This creates a security concept that relies less on cooperation and more on national control and self-assertion. Taken as a whole, the National Security Strategy 2025 shows a country that is redefining its role in the world. From a basic attitude that puts domestic political conflicts at the center and views international politics increasingly through an ideologically tinted lens. For partners and allies, this means that the foreign policy reliability of the United States is no longer primarily institutionally guaranteed, but depends on the domestic political agenda of the government. The National Security Strategy 2025 clearly anchors the strategic focus of the United States in the Western Hemisphere, that is, in North and South America. This focus is not a side aspect, but forms the structural backbone of the entire strategy. The United States describes the double continent, including Greenland, as its natural sphere of influence, whose stability and control take precedence over all other geopolitical commitments. In doing so, the national security strategy explicitly ties in with the classic Monroe Doctrine: cooler die, cooler die. Cooler play has made the vulnerabilities of globalized production chains visible. As a consequence, the national security strategy does not see the reindustrialization of the United States as an economic policy project, but as a security policy necessity. The economic toolbox is also being redefined. Tariffs, protectionist measures, and targeted economic isolation are not only understood as trade policy tools, but also as means of strategic competition. The United States wants to strengthen its industrial base by keeping foreign competitors, especially China, out of the American market and forcing investments in national production capacities. This is linked to the goal of making the United States technologically self-sufficient in the long term. This chapter also discusses changes to the United States Armed Forces' global role. While the United States has shown military presence worldwide in the past, the National Security Strategy 2025 indicates a change. Presence will be shaped more selectively in the future. Resources are to be withdrawn from regions that are no longer considered central to United States interests and instead concentrated in the Hemisphere. This includes both the expansion of military infrastructure in North and South America and a stricter prioritization of foreign deployments. This strategic realignment shows how comprehensively America First is being interpreted as a security policy principle. It not only means a stronger emphasis on national interests, but also the structural transformation of economic, political, and military priorities. With this, the United States positions itself as a country that does not give up its global role, but ties it more clearly to the benefit for its own hemisphere. Finding Christmas gifts can be stressful for some. I used to shop at the last minute too, but in recent years I've started buying them well in advance so I don't have any stress. Now, my sponsor Holy has a really nice idea. There's the Starter Set Deluxe, a Christmas edition. You can give it as a gift if you can't find anything else, or if in doubt, just give it to yourself because you can really save a lot with it. There you can try all of Holy's bestsellers: Holy Energy, Iced Tea, Hydration, and Milkshake. The refreshing drinks and also the milkshakes. In total, 57 servings, including a thermo shaker so the drinks stay cold. That costs 69, but with my code Heinrich, you get 10% off, so it's only 63 euros. You can try it out 57 times. Just mix water with a little powder, shake it, and you can drink and enjoy it right away. All of this with no sugar, aspartame, taurine, artificial coloring or flavors. Alternatively, there's also the limited edition Holy Milkshake Speculus again, Milkshake Speculus. It's something really special. There's also iced tea, winter punch, hibiscus, and the baked apple boar energy drink, all three versions. The flavors I just mentioned are limited edition. That means if you want to try them or if you know them from previous years, you should grab them now. Once they're sold out, they're gone. Use code Heinrich to save 10%. You save on your purchase at Holy and of course you support the channel. But let's get back to the video. The National Security Strategy 2025 continues to describe the Indo-Pacific region as strategically important, but it fundamentally changes the way the United States prioritizes this region. The focus is no longer on military confrontation with China, but rather on a largely economic competition. In the strategy, China is not portrayed as an immediate military threat, but as an economic challenger whose rise has mainly been enabled by unfair trade practices and state-directed industrial capacities. Instead of a classic containment policy, the National Security Strategy 2025 therefore relies on economic instruments. Tariffs, export controls, supply chain relocations, and industrial policy programs are intended to ensure that the United States maintains the technological and industrial lead in the long term, which is defined as a prerequisite for national strength. The strategy stresses that the United States should rely less on Chinese manufacturing and boost its own production. In this context, China appears less as a military adversary and more as a structural economic challenge. At the same time, the national security strategy marks a remarkable departure from the traditional pivot to Asia, which has been the guiding principle of American foreign policy for over a decade. While previous administrations wanted to shift their military and diplomatic resources more strongly to the Asia-Pacific region, the new national security strategy only expresses this ambition in a weakened form. Military commitments in Asia are to be maintained selectively, but without extensive new pledges. The focus is explicitly on deterrence with minimal willingness to escalate. How deterrence is supposed to work when there is no willingness to escalate at the same time remains unclear. Taiwan is mentioned in the strategy but much less prominently than in previous documents. The national security strategy does emphasize the importance of deterrence against China, but avoids clear military guarantees and instead refers to the need to maintain stability through strength. The situation in the South China Sea is also addressed, but in a way that is aimed at minimizing risks and mostly emphasizes economic interests. For allies like Japan and South Korea, the assessment is sober and somewhat critical. The national security strategy stresses that both countries must assume greater political, military, and financial responsibility. This point is not new, but it is stated more sharply in the current strategy. Allies no longer appear as central pillars of American Asia policy, but rather as partners whose value is mainly measured by the extent to which they contribute to burden sharing. Overall, the National Security Strategy 2025 paints a picture of the Asia-Pacific region that is global. The United States is not announcing a withdrawal from Asia, but they are redefining their role in the region, less as a security guarantor and more as a player in a global competition for industrial and economic dominance. The National Security Strategy 2025 includes an unusually large, politically charged section on Europe, highlighting the region's importance and its significance to the United States government. While previous strategies described the continent as an indispensable partner, the current National Security Strategy paints a picture of profound skepticism. Europe does not appear as a reliable ally, but rather as a strategic risk, a region whose political, social, and demographic developments trigger a civilizational erosion. From the United States perspective, this brings the continent into focus for Americans and makes it the main issue in transatlantic relations. At the center is the diagnosis of a European identity and structural crisis. The national security strategy calls Europe politically fragmented, economically weak, and culturally unsettled. Migration, demographic change, and political polarization are seen as signs of decline. In this context, the European Union is not portrayed as an anchor of stability, but rather as an obstacle. Supranational institutions are said to undermine national sovereignty and distort democratic processes. This perspective clearly follows an ideological narrative that fundamentally interprets European integration as a threat to freedom. The political consequence of this is remarkable and marks a historic break. The United States openly announces in the national security strategy that it wants to support political movements in Europe that it describes as patriotic. What would otherwise have been negotiated behind closed doors in diplomatic language is now being explicitly stated. Washington considers shifts in power within Europe to be a legitimate strategic goal, which means nothing other than that the United States is aiming for regime change in Europe. This creates a new sphere where the United States aims to influence Europe's political developments, to encourage the rise of governments ideologically closer to the United States administration. This political influence is justified by the claim that European governments are suppressing the will of their populations, especially regarding migration, Russia policy, and the Ukraine issue. The national security strategy describes a Europe that is led by elites who oppose the interests of their own people. However, this portrayal is in clear contradiction to empirical data found in most European countries. National security strategy puts forward the thesis that the United States of America and Russia are capable of bringing about a solution. However, Europe is preventing peace through its support for Kyiv. The strategy suggests that a plan for a ceasefire developed by Washington and Moscow could have been possible, but that Europe blocked an agreement due to irrational fear of Russia. This portrayal shifts the responsibility for the war from the aggressor to the supporters of the attacked Ukraine and corresponds in key points to the Russian propaganda line. This perspective has wide-ranging consequences. The national security strategy describes a Europe that, due to demographic changes and political fragmentation, will supposedly only be able to defend itself to a limited extent in the coming decades. This raises the question of whether European states can remain reliable NATO partners in the future. At the same time, the stated intentions of the United States to actively influence European domestic politics pose a fundamental challenge for the alliance. The alliance is based on mutual trust, but the national security strategy signals that Washington is willing to undermine this trust in favor of ideological goals. Overall, the chapter on Europe, titled Promoting European Greatness, portrays a Europe that, from the perspective of the national security strategy, is not only strategically problematic, but whose political development is accepted. It is a perspective that treats the continent less as a partner and more as a sphere of influence, thereby calling into question the fundamental logic of transatlantic cooperation. National Security Strategy 2025 signals a major structural shift in United States foreign and security policy. It not only describes a strategic orientation, but also openly identifies a tectonic shift in the international order. It depicts a world that is no longer unipolar or clearly bipolar, but increasingly tripolar. The United States, China, and Russia are the main powers in international politics, but not as ideological blocs. In this constellation, the national security strategy does not see Europe as an independent actor, but as a geopolitical object. The continent appears primarily as a space that, from an American perspective, needs to be stabilized, corrected, or strategically realigned. This fundamentally shifts the transatlantic perspective. Europe is now seen not as an equal partner, but as a region with structural deficits whose politics directly impact America. This perspective calls into question the previous foundation of the trust that has developed over decades, but it also demonstrates a remarkable openness and honesty. At the same time, the new American strategy brings significant risks for the stability of Europe. The announced political interference in European Union countries undermines the foundation of NATO, whose strength is based on mutual sovereignty and reliable coordination. A United States policy that openly supports regime changes in allied countries erodes alliance trust and creates strategic openings for others, especially Russia, which uses similar narratives to destabilize the European order. In addition, the American portrayal of European governments as lacking in democracy can lead to further polarization within Europe. Furthermore, the national security strategy contains a rebalancing of American priorities, which has immediate effects on Ukraine. Not only affects European countries, the political development that the Europeans are experiencing is a political development that affects the European countries. European countries significantly impact the continent itself. The National Security Strategy 2025 serves as a wake-up call. It makes it clear that Europe must strengthen its own ability to act. Political, economic, and military strategic autonomy is no longer an abstract concept, but an immediate necessity. As the United States redefines its role, Europe must also actively define its own. That means strengthening defense capabilities, reducing industrial dependencies, and achieving unity in foreign policy. Europe is left with only two choices: to become a pawn of the United States and Russia, or to become a strong, united Europe that can act independently in a tripolar world. For Germany, this development means a special responsibility. As the largest economy in Europe, as a hub of European politics, and as a central player in NATO on this continent, Berlin has a key role to play. Germany must increase its financial, political, and security involvement. The National Science Foundation makes it clear that the time for strategic co-reading is over. Europe cannot rely on Washington to automatically intervene when European security is threatened. In summary, the National Science Foundation 2025 shows a world in which the United States of America is redefining its role, China is expanding economically, Russia is acting militarily, and Europe must reorient itself. This document offers strategic clarity, but also puts significant strain on traditional partnerships. For Europe, and especially for Germany, the central conclusion is the future of European security increasingly lies in European hands. Only if Europe develops its own strength will it remain a relevant player in a world that is changing dramatically. Share your thoughts on the National Security Strategy 2025 statements in the comments. Thanks for your attention. See you soon. At this point, I would also like to express my heartfelt thanks to the supporters, especially to Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Camp and to Lieutenant Jans van Eck to Bib. Carsten Schulz, Gulasch Nascher, 4000 Tequila, 42. Badass Lawyer, Vision Sound Lab, PKF1. Wu Mahamori, Robert Veal 15, 28. Entertainment, Yanis Gu, Anti-X, Sasha Müller, Cunningham, Stress. Thank you. Without them, it wouldn't be possible like this.